So now let's take a look at approvals within the purchasing module. So from your applications drop-down, navigate to purchasing, setup tab, and configuration. And it's about halfway down here. So approvals here, enable purchasing approval to turn it on. And then you can require a vendor for approval. And then let's say you have a transaction that's been approved and it gets modified. What do you want to happen in that scenario? So do you want to require a reapproval? Do you want it to be if there's only line amount changes or any line or subtotal amount changes? So you have different options here with that. And then for your email notifications, you can check that off so that when there are transactions in the system to be approved, the approver will get an email notification to say, come on in and take a look at these transactions. So once you have it enabled, then you have your approval policies here and you can hit manage, which will bring up this purchasing approval policies page. And you can add here and then select all your different types of transaction definitions. So they do just have to be either quote, order, or invoice for approvals to be set up on them, but you can have a different approval policy by transaction definition. But you can only have one approval policy per definition, but you can have, a different one for each. And you can do approvals whether you are business user, project manager user, or employee user. So that's good to know. You can have employee users in the system that do approvals. So let's say I choose vendor invoice here as my transaction definition. And then down here, I have my different rule types. So value approval, pretty straightforward. If you select value approval, you have to hit edit over here on the manage. And then this is going to go by different levels, which are permissions that get assigned to roles. And then those roles are assigned to your users. So let's say for all of my vendor invoices that are between 1 cent and $50,000, I want them to go to an approver with level 1 approval permissions. And then anything over $50,000, I want to go to someone with level 2. And then let's say 500,000, anything over 500,000, I want it to be level 3. And I want at least 2 people to be approving anything over $500,000 in the system. So just to give you an idea of what these levels are then in your roles. So I'm in the company module looking at roles, and let's just look at the admin role and open up our subscriptions over here, which are the actual permissions. Down here on the purchasing module, if I click permissions, I will see in here that there is purchasing approval levels. So you would give permission for whichever level you want to the role that's applied to the user that you want to be doing approvals. And you also want to give them approved purchase transaction list. So that's your value approval. It's based off levels. You also have value approval progressive. And basically that's just going to be like a step-up process. So if you have, the same setup as we saw before with level 1 was up to 5,000, level 2 was up to 50,000, level 3 was up to 500,000. If you have a $500,000 bill, then level 1 approver is going to approve it first, level 2 approver is going to approve it next, and then it's going to go to a level 3 approval. So it's going to progress through all of those different stages for approval. So then value approval department then is based on the submitter of the transaction, and your value approval transaction department is based on the department that is tagged within the transaction. So there are your value approvals. We also have user level approvals. You can hit user level and then you can go to a specific user for approvals for that specific definition. So I could choose Lisa Campbell, let's say, for my vendor invoice to go to her, or I could pick a user group level. And if you do have user groups set up in the system, then they would appear here in the dropdown. So let's say you had a group set up specifically for vendor invoice approvals. It's going to go to one of them or all of them, and then someone would have to approve it. Okay, so now let's look at department approval. So department approval is going to be the manager of the department that the employee who submitted the transaction is assigned. So if you are the person putting in the transaction, whichever department that you're assigned on your employee file, whoever the manager is of that department gets the approvals when you submit transactions with this type of approval policy. So employee manager approval then is the manager of the employee who submitted the transaction within their employee file. And these are quite similar, but they're a little bit different. So I'll put a note at the end of this video that gives a proper description of them, like just a definition for what they all do, because I know it's a lot to digest right now. So transaction department approval then is the manager of the department that is tagged within the transaction. So it doesn't matter who puts in the transaction, it goes by the department that's tagged in the transaction. So who's the manager of that department? That's the person that's going to be the approver. And then transaction location department. So the location that is tagged within the transaction, the approver is going to be the manager of that location. And then the last one is transaction project manager approval. So the project that is selected in the transaction, who is the project manager on that project? The approvals will go to them. So let's just take a look at our time module. We'll go into our employees setup. So if I edit here beside one of my employees, I do have the option to select a manager for that employee. So let's say if we were doing employee manager approval and we had a manager assigned here, John Carson, for instance, then when that approval policy is in place, John Carson is going to get the approvals whenever Robert Jones puts in transactions. So let's say that's not there, but Robert Jones has the construction operations department tagged in their employee file. So the manager of construction operations, I think it's actually Robert Jones. No, it's Dennis Sanford. So the manager of the department tagged for Robert Jones. So then when Robert Jones puts in a transaction, it goes to Dennis Sanford for approval when it is a department approval. So department approval is going to go to Dennis Sanford. Okay, so the next one then is transaction department approval. So when I'm putting in my vendor invoice and I'm tagging in the dimensions the department, so in my coding down here, I can put in a department. Who is the manager of that department? That's who the approvals will go to. And then if I do transaction location approval, it's going to be the manager of the location. So let's say for Timberline GC, who is the manager for Timberline GC? So there's no manager on this, but obviously if you were using that approval policy, you would have a manager on your locations, and that's how it would get routed for approval. And then transaction project manager approval is going to be whichever project you select on the transaction, who the manager of that project is going to get the approvals for those transactions. So they're the different types. I know that's a lot to take in, and they're similar, but a little bit different. So I'll do a list at the end of this to just kind of go into that in more detail and really lay it out for you. And that should pop up at the end of this video. So there are your purchasing approvals. You do have to remember, of course, once you enable it, that you have to apply the permissions or make sure that you have, those managers put in the correct places for that to get routed correctly. And then I do, of course, recommend testing this in your implementation environment to make sure that it's all going to the right place. And then if you have the email notifications turned on, then the approver will get an email notification to tell them that, you have to come into the system and do those approvals. And then that's going to be in the purchasing module, all tab, approve transactions. And when they come in here, then they'll have the option to either approve or decline. They can select all up here at the top if they have several. And, they can put notes in on the transactions as well to say, why they're declining it. You can do approvals if you're an employee user, but with the limitations of employee users, they won't be able to edit the transactions. They'll only be able to decline them if there's an error, and then they will have to put a note on it to say, this is wrong, this is what you have to change. But if you were a project manager or business user, you'd be able to make those edits yourself. So that is the purchasing approvals. I'll put the list at the end of this to make that a bit more clear for all the different approval policies. And then if you're, trying to set this up and you're not fully getting it, then of course you can hop in a Q&A and get our help with that. And then these are the policies that are in place for Intacct. And then, if you need a more robust approval policy than that and Intacct is not doing it for you, then you can reach out about getting an integration that has a better, more robust approval policy in place.